would like to know what is happening in the carbonate system. Now, water at the surface of the earth inevitably contains dissolved carbon dioxide. Let's highlight that part of it, dissolved carbon dioxide. Now, this dissolved carbon dioxide could have occurred either as a result of equilibration with the atmosphere or because of respiration of organisms. In essence, carbon dioxide reacts with water to give you carbonic acid. Now, this can be represented as an equation as CO2 plus H2O, a two-way reaction to give you H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. Now, some of the carbonic acids dissociate to further form bicarbonate, which is HCO3 minus, and hydrogen ions. Now, this is the second equation you have to keep in mind. The first is, of course, CO2 plus H2O gives you H2CO3. Next is the dissociation of H2CO3 to give you H plus and HCO3 minus. Some of the bicarbonate will dissociate to an additional hydrogen ion and a carbonate ion. That becomes equation 3. So the H2CO3 here is going to give you H plus, which is an additional hydrogen, and a carbonate ion. So simply by the dissociation of carbonic acid, you have actually produced a carbonate ion. This is a very important consideration. Essentially then, if you come into the topic of equilibrium constants as applied in carbonate chemistry, we can write three equilibrium constants, for these reactions. The first one, the solubility product, SP solubility product constant for carbonate is written as the activity, not the concentration, but activity of carbonic acid divided by the fugacity of carbon dioxide. The activity has been explained in the past, but in essence here we're going to be replacing all the concentrations with activity. Also, the first equilibrium constant K1 is written as activity of hydrogen plus into activity of HCO3 minus, divided by activity of H2CO3. This comes from the first equation, or in the previous slide it was equation number 2. The second equilibrium constant K2 is given as activity of H plus into activity of CO3 2 minus, which is carbonate, over activity of HCO3 minus or bicarbonate. Now these equilibrium constants you have to remember, because then you translate it into reactions which are, for example, summarized in the table below as a function of temperature. So if I were to look at the equilibrium constant, for the carbonate system as a function of temperature, and here the temperature has been fixed to anywhere from 0 to 90 degrees. You will find that the pK of CO2 changes from 1.1 to all the way down to 1.94. So pK1 representing this equation number 1, and pK2 representing equation K2, you can find that as the temperature increases, pK1 seems to decrease overall. pK2 also seems to decrease. In other words, the ability to produce reactants over products, that balance is changing with temperature. So if you look at the pK for calcite as versus aragonite, The pK for calcite is 8.3, increases all the way to 9.1. That for aragonite starts from 8.2, goes all the way to 9.02. So in essence, this table tells that this whole chemistry or equilibrium constants keep changing as a function of temperature. In other words, depending on which temperature you're dealing with, whether it is external temperature is 25, or in somewhat warmer periods where it would have been 45, or in a temperate country where the temperature is about 5 degrees, then the dissociation constants are reflected accordingly, as you will see in this table. Now, we always make assumptions in everything that we are working with. In this series of reactions that we saw earlier, we have simplified things somewhat and assumed that dissolved carbon dioxide reacts completely with water to form carbonic acid or H2CO3. This assumption is not totally correct. Why? This is because much of the dissolved carbon dioxide will actually be present as distinct molecular species or CO2 aqueous. Basically then, the reaction of CO2 plus H2O, a two-way reaction to give you carbonic acid, actually consists of two reactions. Okay, one is CO2 gas has to convert to CO2 aqueous. Now this is where most of the headache lies, because not all the gas may convert to CO2 aqueous. Some may convert, some may not convert. So depending on the resident conditions, you will know exactly how much of carbon dioxide has actually converted to aqueous form of carbon dioxide. Having thus converted to aqueous form, this carbon dioxide can now react with water to form carbonic acid. Okay. So the equilibrium for the second reaction basically favors carbon dioxide in an aqueous form, not gas form. However, it is analytically difficult to distinguish between the species of carbon dioxide in aqueous form and carbonic acid, since carbon is there in both places. Therefore, carbon dioxide in aqueous form is often combined with carbonic acid, okay, when representing aqueous species. So here is another assumption. You take this and you combine with this to say I have a particular aqueous species. Now, essentially, the importance of the carbonate system has been omitted from this video, but it's such that the dissociation and provision of hydrogen ions into solution or associating and taking up free hydrogen ions by the carbonate system makes it a system which can control the pH of many natural waters. Okay, now let's move on a little bit further. We know that calcium carbonate can dissociate into calcium 2 plus and carbonate ion. So the carbonate ions produced this way will associate with hydrogen ions to form bicarbonate as shown in this reaction. In other words, CO3 2 minus plus hydrogen will tend to give you HCO3. Now when you increase the pH of the solution, okay, water containing high concentrations of calcium, sometimes magnesium, carbonate are referred to as hard water, and such waters are generally somewhat alkaline. Now suppose we have a known activity for all carbonate species in solution as represented by this expression, where activity of carbonic acid plus activity of bicarbonate plus activity of carbonate ion is equal to the summation of carbon dioxide, giving you 10 to the power of minus 2. From this and the dissociation constants, you can basically calculate the amount of each species present as a function of pH and temperature. Finally, we can actually use the equilibrium constant expressions to obtain substitutions for the carbonic acid and the carbonate ion activities in the last equation. There are functions of bicarbonate ion activity and pH. We can then solve the last equation to obtain an expression for the activity of the bicarbonate ion as a function of total carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion activity. Now this is given by this expression here, where the activity of bicarbonate is nothing but the total amount of carbon dioxide divided by activity of hydrogen divided by K1 plus 1 plus K2 divided by activity of hydrogen. Again, you don't have to remember this, but you just need to understand, okay, that you can actually obtain an expression and simplify this to solve many equations. Now, similar equations may be found for carbonic acid and the carbonate ion as well. Carrying out these calculations at various pH, you can inevitably construct a graph as shown right down here. Okay. Now, in this figure, we can see that carbonic acid is the dominant species at low pH. At the intermediate pH range, okay, you have bicarbonate as the dominant species, and at a high pH range, you have the carbonate ion as your dominant species. Okay, the dividers for this range is always here and here. What you can also see that as the carbonic acid ions are very high here, as you increase your pH, okay, the hydrogen ion concentration also decreases with increasing pH. Not only that, you can see that at pH 6.4, the amount of carbonic acid activity is equivalent to the activity of the bicarbonate. Likewise, at pH 10.33, okay, the activity of bicarbonate ions is equivalent to the activity of carbonate ions. So you have then, as you move from pH 1 all the way up to pH 9, a decrease in the carbonate ion activity with a concomitant increase in the bicarbonate ion activity. At a much higher pH, after pH 9, there is a decrease in the bicarbonate ion activity and definitely an increase in the carbonate ion activity. Now you need to understand this first, okay? And during this time, you notice that the OH or hydroxyl ion species is increasing in its activity. As a whole, if you have understood this entire diagram, you have now understood carbonate chemistry. Why you have certain species at certain pH and why do you have certain types of minerals being formed at certain pH and so on and so forth. Remember, this whole diagram, okay, is subject to the resident pressure and carbon dioxide pressure. The temperature, carbon dioxide pressure is very, very important. So, for example, here pH is, you should know what the pH is and your partial pressure of carbon dioxide you should also know. If you change these factors, this picture is going to shift either way. Alright, having said that, we are coming more or less to the end of this video. I hope that you have enjoyed learning these aspects of aquatic chemistry, specifically carbonate chemistry, as much as I have enjoyed teaching them to you. Look out for more videos on this subject and happy learning.